"I wish you were already gone," my son said, his voice calm, almost thoughtful, as if he were commenting on the weather instead of speaking about his own mother. And I remember noticing the way the overhead light reflected off the polished wood of the dining table. The same table I had set every Sunday for over 30 years, the same table where he once spilled orange juice as a child and looked at me with wide, apologetic eyes. But tonight there was no apology, no hesitation, just a quiet finality that settled into the room like dust, and I didn't react, not the way anyone might expect. I didn't gasp or argue or even look up right away. I simply placed my fork down beside my plate, aligning it carefully with the knife as if that small act of order could hold everything else together. And for a moment no one spoke, not my son, not his wife Vanessa, who sat across from me with her hands folded neatly in her lap, watching, always watching, her expression composed but her eyes alert. Searching for something, perhaps a crack, a sign that I would break, but I didn't give her that. I had learned long ago that silence could be stronger than any protest, and in that silence I became aware of the smallest details, the hum of the refrigerator in the next room, the faint ticking of the clock above the doorway, the way Michael avoided looking at me directly, focusing instead on the condensation forming on his glass of water, as though the surface of it held more interest than the woman who had raised him. And it was in that quiet, suspended moment that something inside me shifted, not shattered, not even cracked, but shifted, like a door closing softly in a distant room, because the truth is, by the time he said those words, I already knew something was wrong. I had known it for at least 48 hours, ever since that phone call, the one that came just after 8 in the morning while I was standing in the kitchen measuring out coffee grounds the way I always did. 1 scoop for each cup, plus 1 extra, a habit my late husband used to laugh about, and the voice on the other end had been polite, professional, asking if I was Evelyn Carter and if I had recently authorized any changes to my financial accounts, and I remember pausing, the spoon hovering midair as I tried to understand the question, because no, I hadn't authorized anything, not recently, not ever, without knowing exactly what I was signing. And yet the man continued, explaining in careful terms that certain documents had been submitted, requests had been made, signatures had been provided, all bearing my name, and I felt then, for the first time, that subtle, creeping sensation that something in my life had been moved, not taken outright, not yet, but rearranged in a way that left me standing just slightly outside of it. And when I hung up the phone, I didn't call Michael, I didn't confront anyone. I simply stood there in my kitchen, looking out at the backyard where the grass had grown a little too long and the morning light stretched across the fence in soft, familiar patterns, and I realized that whatever was happening, it wasn't sudden, it wasn't impulsive, it had been building quietly, piece by piece, in conversations I wasn't included in decisions made without my knowledge, in glances exchanged across rooms when I wasn't supposed to notice. And so when my son finally spoke those words at the dinner table, when he wished me gone with that same detached tone he now used for everything, I understood that this moment wasn't the beginning of anything. It was simply the first time the truth had been spoken out loud, and I chose, very deliberately, to remain still, because sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is let people believe you have no idea what they've already done. The next morning arrived without ceremony, the kind of quiet, pale morning that makes everything feel slightly unreal, as if the world itself is holding its breath, and I moved through the house the same way I always had, step by step, without rushing, without hesitation. Even though nothing felt quite the same anymore, I brewed my coffee, measuring each scoop carefully, listening to the familiar drip and hum of the machine as it filled the kitchen with that steady, comforting sound, and for a moment I allowed myself to pretend that everything was still intact, that I was still part of this home in the way I used to be. But the illusion did not last long, because when I reached for my favorite mug, the one with the small chip on the rim that Michael had once tried to throw away years ago, it was not there, and in its place was a new set of matching cups, identical, untouched. As if someone had decided that my small imperfections no longer belonged, I stood there for a second longer than necessary, then chose one of the new cups and poured my coffee anyway, because sometimes the absence of something speaks louder than any words. And as I walked into the living room, I noticed other changes, subtle but deliberate. The framed photographs had been rearranged, my late husband's picture no longer at the center of the mantel but shifted to the side. replaced by a newer photo of Michael and Vanessa taken during their last vacation, both of them smiling in that effortless way people do when they believe everything is going according to plan, and I studied that photo for a moment, not with anger, not even with sadness, but with a kind of quiet understanding that settled deeper with each passing second, because none of this had happened overnight. These changes, these small adjustments, they were part of a process, one that I had been living inside without fully seeing until now. And as I sat down in the armchair by the window, the one I had used every morning for years, I noticed the cushion felt different, firmer, less worn, and it took me a moment to realize why. The old cushion, the one that had shaped itself to me over time, had been replaced, just like the mug, just like the photographs, just like everything else that carried any trace of me. And I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the bitterness settle on my tongue, grounding me in the present. Because there was something else I needed to confirm, something that had been quietly waiting since that phone call, and after finishing my cup, I stood up, walked down the hallway, and entered the small study at the back of the house where I kept my documents, my records. Everything organized in the way I trusted, but when I opened the drawer where I kept my financial statements, I immediately saw that the folders had been shifted, not dramatically, just enough that someone unfamiliar with the system might not notice, but I noticed, because I had arranged them myself, and as I flipped through the papers, scanning each page with steady eyes, I found what I was looking for: signatures that were not mine, authorizations I had never given, decisions that had been made without a single word spoken to me, and I did not gasp, I did not rush to confront anyone. I simply closed the folder, placed it back exactly where I had found it, and stood there for a moment in the quiet, because the truth was no longer something I suspected, it was something I could see clearly, laid out in ink and paper, and as I turned off the light and stepped out of the room, I understood that whatever they believed they were doing, whatever plan they thought was unfolding quietly around me, they had already made one critical mistake. They had assumed that I would either not notice, or that if I did, I would not understand, and that assumption, more than anything else, was what would cost them everything. That afternoon, I did exactly what I had always done. I prepared dinner at 4:30, not because anyone had asked me to, but because routine has a way of revealing truths that chaos often hides, and as I stood in the kitchen slicing carrots into even pieces, I could hear Michael and Vanessa in the next room, their voices low but not low enough, the kind of careful quiet people use when they believe they are being discreet, and I did not move closer. I did not need to, because when you listen long enough, patterns begin to form even from fragments, and I caught enough to understand: numbers, timelines, a mention of paperwork being finalized soon, Vanessa's voice sharper than usual as she said something about delays, about things taking longer than expected, and Michael responded in that same measured tone he had used the night before, reassuring her, telling her it would all be resolved, that I would not make it difficult, and I paused for a moment, the knife resting against the cutting board, because there it was again, that assumption, that quiet certainty that I was a factor to be managed, not a person to be considered, and I resumed cutting, each slice deliberate, each movement controlled, because anger would have been easy, confrontation even easier, but neither of those would serve me now, not when what I needed was clarity, and so I continued preparing dinner, setting the table for 3 as I always did, placing each plate with the same care I had shown for decades, because consistency can be disarming. It can make people careless, and when they sat down later that evening, everything appeared normal. The food was warm, the table was set, the atmosphere calm, and for a few minutes we ate in silence, the kind that might have once been comfortable but now felt constructed, and then Vanessa spoke, her tone light, almost casual, asking if I had considered downsizing, suggesting that a smaller place might be easier to manage, less upkeep, less responsibility, and I looked at her then, not with surprise, not even with suspicion, but with a steady gaze that made her pause for just a fraction of a second before she smiled again, and I nodded slowly, as if I were considering the idea for the first time, even though I already knew where this conversation was meant to lead, and Michael joined in, adding that it might be a good opportunity, that I deserved something simpler, something more convenient, and I listened, allowing them to build their argument piece by piece, because people reveal more when they believe they are persuading you, and by the time they finished, the picture was clear. They were not offering a suggestion, they were presenting a plan, one that had been discussed, refined, and decided long before it was ever brought to me, and I took a small sip of water, placing the glass back down carefully before speaking, my voice calm, measured, exactly as it had always been, telling them that it sounded reasonable, that I would think about it. And I watched the subtle shift in their expressions, the relief, the satisfaction, the quiet confirmation that things were moving in the direction they expected, and in that moment, I understood something with absolute certainty. They were not just underestimating me. They had already written the ending in their minds, already decided how this story would conclude, and that, more than anything else, was what gave me the advantage, because while they believed they were guiding me toward an outcome, I had already begun preparing for one they would never see coming. That night, after the dishes were cleared and the house settled into its usual quiet, I returned to the study once more, not with urgency, but with intention, because there are moments in life when the past stops being a memory and becomes evidence, and I knew exactly where to look. The bottom drawer of the old desk, the one my husband had insisted we keep even when everything else had been replaced, saying some things were worth holding on to, and as I pulled it open, the faint scent of paper and time greeted me, familiar and steady, and I reached for the folder I had not touched in months, perhaps longer, the one labeled in his handwriting, neat and deliberate, a small detail that suddenly felt heavier than it should have, and I carried it to the desk, sitting down slowly as if the act itself required a certain level of respect, because it did, not for the paper, but for what it represented, and when I opened it, the contents were exactly as I remembered, every document in place, every page aligned, the structure of a life built carefully over decades, and as I began to read, line by line, I could hear his voice in the back of my mind, not in words, but in that quiet certainty he always carried, the way he approached everything with a sense of order and foresight that I had once taken for granted, and now I understood why he had been so particular, why he had insisted on certain protections, certain clauses that at the time had seemed unnecessary, almost excessive, but now revealed themselves as something else entirely. Not paranoia, but preparation, because woven into those pages were conditions, safeguards that ensured no single decision could be made without consequence, no transfer completed without validation, no assumption left unchecked, and I felt something settle inside me as I read, not relief, not yet, but recognition, because the picture that had been forming over the past 2 days was now complete, every piece fitting into place with a clarity that left no room for doubt, and I closed the folder gently, placing my hand on top of it for a moment as if anchoring myself to something solid, something real, and I allowed myself to remember, not just the documents, but the man who had put them there, the evenings we spent at this very desk going over bills and plans, the quiet conversations about the future, about security, about making sure that no matter what happened, I would be protected, and I realized then that he had seen something I had not, or perhaps he had simply understood people in a way I had chosen not to, because I believed in family, in loyalty, in the idea that love was enough to keep everything intact, and now, sitting alone in that dimly lit room, I understood how fragile that belief had been, and yet I did not feel anger, not in the way one might expect, because anger demands immediacy, and what I needed now was patience, and so I stood up, returned the folder to its place, and turned off the light, leaving the room exactly as I had found it, because there was a certain symmetry in that, a quiet acknowledgement that while others had been rearranging my life without permission, there were still things they could not touch, things they did not even know existed, and as I walked back down the hallway, the house felt different again, not empty, not even hostile, but clear, as if the illusion had been stripped away, leaving only what was true, and in that clarity, I found something unexpected, not fear, not uncertainty, but control, because for the first time since this all began, I was no longer reacting to what was happening around me. I was beginning to understand how to shape what would happen next. The following morning, I made a decision that appeared small on the surface but carried more weight than anything I had done so far. I picked up the phone and called the number that had reached me 2 days earlier. The same calm, professional voice answered, and when I confirmed my name, there was a brief pause on the line, the kind that suggests recognition, as if my situation had already been noted, already been placed somewhere in a system that understood exactly what was unfolding, and I spoke carefully, choosing each word with intention, explaining that I had reviewed my documents, that I had found discrepancies, and that I wanted to understand what actions had been initiated under my name, and the man listened without interrupting. his tone steady, respectful, as he confirmed that certain transfer requests had indeed been submitted, that signatures had been provided, and that in normal circumstances, those requests would have already been processed, but there had been a delay, a procedural hold triggered by one specific detail, and I leaned slightly forward in my chair, my fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table as I asked him to explain, and he did, outlining a clause, a requirement embedded within the documentation that prevented any unilateral changes without direct verification, something that required my physical presence, my explicit confirmation, and as he spoke, I felt that same quiet recognition settle in again, the same realization that what had been set in motion against me was not as complete as they believed, not as secure as they assumed, and when the call ended, I did not feel relief, not yet, but I did feel clarity, and clarity is a powerful thing when others are operating on assumptions, and later that day, when Michael returned home, he found me exactly where I always was, seated in the living room with a book open in my lap, the afternoon light stretching across the floor in long, familiar lines, and he paused for a moment in the doorway, as if assessing something, perhaps trying to determine whether anything had changed, and I looked up with a small, neutral smile, asking him how his day had been, and he answered in the same measured tone, speaking about work, about meetings, about things that sounded important but carried no real substance, and I listened, nodding occasionally, because sometimes the most effective way to observe someone is to let them believe everything is still normal, and Vanessa joined us shortly after, her presence filling the room with that same controlled energy she always carried, and she asked, almost too casually, if I had given any more thought to their suggestion, and I met her gaze calmly, telling her that I had, that I agreed it might be time to make some changes, and I watched as that brief flicker of satisfaction passed between them, subtle but unmistakable, and Michael leaned slightly forward, asking what I had in mind, and I told him that I thought it would be best to handle everything properly, to meet with a professional, to review all the necessary paperwork, to ensure that every detail was addressed correctly, because after all, something as important as this should not be rushed, and there was a moment, just a fraction of a second, where something in his expression shifted, perhaps uncertainty, perhaps the faint realization that the process might not be as simple as they had anticipated, but it passed quickly, replaced by a nod, by agreement, by the confidence of someone who still believed they were in control, and I returned my attention to the book in my lap, turning the page slowly, because the truth was, the moment I had made that phone call, everything had already begun to change, not in ways they could see, not yet, but in ways that would soon make themselves impossible to ignore, and for now, all I needed to do was continue exactly as I had been, calm, patient, and just visible enough to let them believe that nothing had shifted at all. 2 days later, everything moved exactly as I had suggested, as if the idea had been theirs from the beginning, and that was the part that interested me most, how quickly people accept a path when they believe it benefits them, how easily they step forward without questioning where it might lead, and that morning I took my time getting ready, choosing a simple outfit, nothing dramatic, nothing that would draw attention, because this was not about appearances, it was about precision. And when I stepped into the hallway, I could hear Vanessa in the kitchen speaking in a low voice, her words clipped, controlled, as she discussed timing, documents, confirming appointments, and when she saw me, she stopped immediately, her expression shifting into something softer, something practiced, and she smiled, asking if I was ready, and I nodded, returning the same calm composure I had carried for days now, because by this point, calm had become more than a reaction, it was a strategy, and the drive to the office was quiet, the kind of silence that feels intentional, not empty. Michael kept his eyes on the road, his hands steady on the wheel, and Vanessa occasionally checked her phone, her fingers moving quickly across the screen, and I sat in the back seat, watching the familiar streets pass by, each turn, each stoplight, each storefront a reminder that life outside this situation continued exactly as it always had, unaffected, unaware, and when we arrived, the building stood tall and ordinary, glass doors reflecting the morning light, nothing about it suggested the weight of what was about to unfold inside, and as we entered, I noticed the way Vanessa walked slightly ahead, her posture confident, her pace measured, as if she had already rehearsed this moment in her mind, and perhaps she had, perhaps they both had, Because people rarely act without first imagining the outcome they expect, and we were greeted by a receptionist who spoke politely, directing us to a conference room where everything was already prepared, papers neatly arranged on the table, pens placed with intention, the kind of setup that suggests finality, that suggests decisions have already been made, and I took my seat slowly, allowing myself a moment to observe, to take in every detail, the placement of the documents, the subtle glance exchanged between Michael and Vanessa, the faint tension that lingered beneath their composed expressions, and then the door opened, and a man stepped in, introducing himself with a firm but respectful tone, his presence calm, professional, and as he began to speak, outlining the purpose of the meeting, explaining the documents in front of us, I listened carefully, not to the words themselves, but to the structure behind them, the way everything had been arranged to appear straightforward, to appear routine, and I let him finish without interruption, because timing, I had learned, was everything, and when he finally turned to me, asking for confirmation, asking if I was ready to proceed, I met his gaze steadily, my hands resting lightly on the table. And for a brief moment, the room seemed to pause, as if even the air itself was waiting, and I spoke, my voice calm, clear, without hesitation, telling him that before anything moved forward, I would like to review a specific clause, one that required direct verification, one that ensured no changes could be made without my explicit approval, and I watched as the smallest shift crossed his expression, not surprise, but recognition, and in that moment everything changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that could not be undone, because the foundation they believed was solid had just been called into question, and I leaned back slightly in my chair, folding my hands together with quiet certainty, because for the first time since this began, I was no longer following their plan, I was leading the conversation, and they had not prepared for that. The room did not erupt, there were no raised voices, no dramatic reactions, just a quiet shift in the atmosphere that was far more telling than anything loud could have been, and I watched it happen in real time, the way Michael's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly, the way Vanessa's fingers tightened around the pen she had been holding, her composure still intact but no longer effortless, and the man across from us paused, not confused, not uncertain, but recalibrating, as if adjusting to a variable he had not been informed about. And that was when I understood just how much of this had been arranged without full transparency, because professionals do not hesitate unless something has been misrepresented, and I allowed that silence to linger for a moment longer than necessary before speaking again, clarifying that I wanted to ensure all legal safeguards were properly acknowledged before any documents were signed, my tone steady, respectful, leaving no room for interpretation, and the man nodded, shifting the papers slightly as he began to review the section I had referenced, his expression focused now, attentive in a way that suggested this meeting was no longer proceeding as originally expected, and beside me, I could feel the tension without needing to look directly, the subtle change in breathing, the unspoken communication passing between Michael and Vanessa, the realization beginning to take shape that something was no longer aligned with their assumptions, and still, I remained calm, because this was not the moment for confrontation, it was the moment for clarity, and clarity, when introduced at the right time, has a way of unraveling even the most carefully constructed plans, and as the man continued speaking, explaining the clause in precise terms, outlining the requirement for direct authorization and the implications of any prior submissions made without it, I noticed the way Vanessa shifted in her seat, her confidence no longer as steady as before, her earlier certainty replaced by something more cautious, more calculated, and Michael finally looked at me then, really looked at me, not with dismissal, not with indifference, but with something closer to uncertainty, as if he were seeing a version of me he had not accounted for, and I held his gaze for just a moment, not long enough to challenge, but long enough to be understood, because sometimes understanding does not come from words, it comes from the absence of them, and when I finally looked back at the documents, I reached forward slowly, my hand resting lightly on the top page, not to sign, not yet, but simply to indicate that the decision was mine, that it always had been, and that realization settled into the room with a quiet finality that no one could ignore, and the man cleared his throat gently, asking if I would like to proceed with a full review before making any commitments, and I nodded, because there was no reason to rush, no reason to move forward until every detail had been brought into the light, and as he began organizing the documents for a more thorough examination, I leaned back slightly in my chair, allowing the process to unfold at a pace I controlled, and for the first time since this had begun, the dynamic had shifted completely, not in a way that required force or argument, but in a way that simply could not be reversed, because once people realize they have misjudged you, once they see that the role they assigned no longer fits, everything they thought was certain begins to fall apart, and I could see that realization taking hold, quietly, steadily, in both of them, and I knew then that whatever came next would not be dictated by their expectations, but by my decisions, and that was something they had never prepared for. By the time the documents were fully spread across the table, the atmosphere in the room had changed in a way that no one could pretend otherwise. The earlier sense of quiet confidence that Michael and Vanessa had carried with them was gone, replaced by something more cautious, more measured, and I could see it in the way Vanessa leaned slightly back in her chair, no longer guiding the conversation but waiting, watching, calculating her next move, and the man across from us continued his explanation, his tone precise, careful, as he outlined the implications of the clause I had brought forward, explaining that any prior submissions lacking direct verification could not be processed as valid, that any attempt to initiate changes without full compliance would be flagged, delayed, and ultimately denied until proper authorization was obtained, and I listened without interrupting, my hands resting calmly in front of me, because everything he was saying was not new information, not to me, but hearing it spoken aloud in that setting carried a different kind of weight, one that settled into the room and left no space for misunderstanding, and when he finished, there was a brief silence, the kind that invites someone else to speak, to respond, to regain control of the narrative, but no one did, not immediately, and then Michael cleared his throat, his voice quieter than before as he asked a question about the timeline, about what would happen next, and the man answered plainly, explaining that any future action would require my explicit presence, my direct consent, and a full review of all supporting documentation, and as he spoke, I noticed the way Michael's expression shifted again, the confidence that had once been there now replaced by something closer to realization. Not complete, not yet, but forming, and Vanessa finally spoke, her tone still composed but no longer as smooth, asking whether the previous submissions could simply be corrected, adjusted, resubmitted, and the answer she received was just as measured, just as clear, that any attempt to proceed without full transparency would only complicate matters further, that the proper course would be to begin again, this time with all parties present and all requirements fully acknowledged, and I allowed that to settle for a moment before moving my hand slightly, drawing their attention back to the documents in front of me, and I spoke calmly, stating that I would prefer to take additional time to review everything independently, to ensure that every detail was understood before any decisions were made, and there was no argument, no immediate resistance, just a quiet acceptance that the process was no longer in their control, and I could see it then, clearly. The moment the balance shifted completely, not in a dramatic way, not with raised voices or confrontation, but in the simple fact that the outcome they had anticipated was no longer guaranteed, and as I gathered the papers, aligning them neatly before placing them back on the table, I looked up briefly, meeting Michael's eyes, and in that brief exchange, something passed between us, not anger, not accusation, but recognition, because for the first time, he understood that the position he thought I held in this situation had never truly existed, that the version of me he had been dealing with was one he had constructed himself, based on assumptions that no longer applied, and I stood slowly, thanking the man for his time, my voice steady, my movements unhurried, and as we prepared to leave, I noticed how different everything felt compared to when we had arrived, the same room, the same table, the same documents, but an entirely different reality, one where the outcome was no longer theirs to dictate, and as we stepped out into the hallway, the silence between us carried more meaning than any words could have, because the truth, once revealed, does not need to be repeated, it simply remains, undeniable, shaping everything that comes after. The drive home was quieter than the one before, not because there was nothing to say, but because too much had already been understood, and I sat in the back seat once again, watching the road stretch ahead in long, uninterrupted lines, noticing how Michael's hands gripped the steering wheel just a little tighter than before, how Vanessa remained unusually still beside him, her phone resting untouched in her lap, and I did not fill the silence. I did not offer reassurance or explanation. Because neither was necessary, and when we arrived at the house, I stepped out first, moving at my usual pace, neither hurried nor slow, simply steady, and as I walked up the front steps, I paused for a brief moment, my hand resting lightly against the doorframe, taking in the familiar shape of the home I had lived in for decades, the place that had once felt unquestionable, permanent, and I realized then that permanence is not something given, it is something maintained, something protected. And I stepped inside without waiting for either of them, setting my bag down in its usual place before moving into the living room, where the late afternoon light had begun to fade, casting long shadows across the floor, and I sat down in my chair, the same chair that had been replaced, adjusted, subtly altered, and yet still mine, and for a moment, I allowed the quiet to settle around me, because there is a difference between silence that isolates and silence that clarifies, and this was the latter, and after a few minutes, I heard their footsteps in the hallway, slower now, less certain, and Michael entered the room first, stopping just short of where I sat, as if unsure how close to come, and Vanessa remained just behind him, her posture composed but no longer assured, and for the first time since this began, it was not me who felt displaced, it was them, standing in a space that no longer responded to them in the way they had expected, and Michael spoke, his voice lower than usual, asking what I intended to do next, and I looked at him calmly, not with anger, not with accusation, but with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding, and I told him that I would be reviewing everything carefully, that no decisions would be made without full transparency, and that from this point forward any discussion regarding my home, my finances, or my future would include me directly, not as a formality, but as the only authority that mattered, and there was no argument, no attempt to interrupt, just a quiet acceptance that settled between us, because some truths, once spoken, cannot be negotiated, and Vanessa shifted slightly, as if preparing to respond, but then she stopped, perhaps recognizing that there was nothing she could say that would return things to what they had been, and I stood slowly, smoothing the fabric of my sleeve with a small, deliberate motion before walking past them, not in avoidance, not in retreat, but in completion, because the conversation did not need to continue. The outcome had already been set in motion, and as I reached the hallway, I paused just long enough to speak one final time, my voice steady, quiet, carrying the weight of everything that had led to this moment, telling them that there is a difference between being silent and being unaware, and that confusing the two is a mistake people rarely recover from. And then I continued walking, leaving them where they stood, not because I needed distance, but because I no longer needed to prove anything. And as I closed the door to my room behind me, I felt no anger, no bitterness, only a calm certainty that what they had tried to take had never truly been theirs to begin with, and that understanding, more than anything else, was what ensured they would never succeed.